Welcome to Tochi Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now, let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. Juliet never imagined she'd set foot in the city again, not after everything it took from her. The dusty road that led into town now looked like a scar across memories she tried so hard to forget. But life, with its bitter sense of irony, had pulled her back in. She had returned only to visit her aunt, who had taken ill, but the moment she stepped off the bus, she felt the weight of every stare, every whispered insult, every mocking headline that once bore her name. Juliet no longer dressed in pearls or polished heels. She wore a plain wrapper and blouse, her hair neatly tied, her spirit quieter, more worn, but still flickering. She hadn't come to be seen. She wanted to slip in and out like a shadow. But fate had other plans. It was while she was tending to her aunt that a sleek black car pulled up outside the compound, drawing attention from curious neighbors. Out stepped an older man in a traditional agbada, one of Charles's mother's longtime drivers. He handed Juliet a sealed letter, his eyes kind but his voice low with urgency. "Madam wants to see you," he said. "She's very sick. She says it's important." Juliet stared at the envelope for minutes before opening it. The writing was shaky, the words heavy with emotion. "Juliet, if you ever find it in your heart to forgive an old woman, come. I have no right to ask, but I must. Charles is not safe where he is. Please come. Help him." Her heart stopped. The same woman who once orchestrated her public disgrace, the woman who pretended to be a maid just to test her, was now asking her for help? Juliet's hands trembled as she folded the letter and stared at the floor. Her heart was torn. She wanted to scream, to burn the letter, to finally close the chapter that had haunted her. But something in those shaky words, the desperation, the guilt, the plea, cracked her defenses. She didn't know what help she could possibly offer Charles. He had clearly moved on. She had seen the gossip blogs months ago. He was engaged to someone new, someone perfect. Juliet had no place in his world. Yet that tiny flicker in her chest, the same one that always beat louder when his name came up, refused to die. Against her better judgment, she packed her small bag, kissed her aunt goodbye, and boarded the bus headed back to the very city that once chewed her up and spat her out. When Juliet arrived at the mansion, it was as though time folded in on itself. The gates she once passed through as a nobody were now familiar. The driver welcomed her with warm eyes, leading her into a dimly lit room where Charles's mother lay on a recliner. The woman had aged visibly, her skin pale, her once commanding presence now replaced with fragile humility. Juliet didn't speak. She stood at the doorway, arms folded, heart racing. "You came," the old woman whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "I don't deserve it, but I prayed you would." Juliet's lips tightened, but she said nothing. The old woman gestured to the seat beside her. "He's walking into fire, Juliet. That girl, she'll destroy him. I thought I could handle it, but I can't. I wronged you once trying to test your heart. Maybe this is my punishment. But please help him. Help my son." And just like that, the pain Juliet buried began to rise again. Not because she missed Charles, but because despite all the wounds, a part of her still cared enough to want him saved. The next day, Juliet attended a gathering at Charles's family home under the old woman's invitation. The event was informal, meant to introduce Linda, Charles's fiancée, to a few close family friends. Juliet remained discreet, seated quietly in the corner, avoiding all attention. But the moment Linda entered the room, all pretense of peace evaporated. She was stunning, tall, fair-skinned, with sleek braids and a voice that cut through the air like broken glass. Her laugh was loud, her words careless, and the moment her eyes fell on Juliet, they narrowed with silent judgment. "Who invited the house, help to the party?" she said under her breath, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Laughter rippled from a few sycophantic guests. Juliet remained calm, refusing to react, but inside her chest, her heartbeat thundered. It wasn't the insult that stung, it was the familiarity. Linda was exactly who Juliet had once been, arrogant, entitled, and blind to her own cruelty. Charles eventually entered the room, and his eyes lit up briefly when he saw Juliet. He walked over to her, offering a warm but awkward smile. "Juliet," he said, "you look different. Peaceful." She smiled gently, unsure how to answer. Linda watched the exchange with thinly veiled disdain. "Oh, so this is Juliet," she said, her tone sweetly venomous. "The infamous slapper of mothers. I've heard stories." Charles frowned, but before he could speak, Juliet rose calmly. "I was just leaving," she said. "I didn't mean to disrupt your moment." But as she turned, Charles gently grabbed her wrist. "Please don't go," he said, his voice lower, more personal. "It's been a long time." Linda rolled her eyes and walked off, dragging another guest with her. Juliet sighed. The pain of being judged so quickly, so loudly, pierced deeper than she'd expected. She had grown, changed, but to them, she would always be the girl who once slapped an old woman. Later that evening, Juliet sat alone on the mansion's veranda, watching the guests laugh inside. Charles joined her, this time without Linda nearby. They spoke quietly about life, family, the places they had seen, and the pain they had endured. "You've changed," Charles said, glancing at her. "Not just how you talk, you carry peace now. Like someone who's fought many battles and won." Juliet looked away, unsure of what to say. She wasn't there for compliments. She was there to stop a disaster from happening. "Charles," she said softly, "Linda, she may be beautiful and confident," but she paused. She couldn't bring herself to tear another woman down. Not again. "Just be careful." Charles chuckled bitterly. "I know. But I'm tired of fighting my mother. This marriage is more about her than it is about me." Juliet's eyes softened. She saw herself in him now, stuck, suffocating, misunderstood. And it broke her all over again. The morning after the event, Juliet awoke to whispers. Gossip had already begun to swirl. People were talking, accusing her of trying to seduce Charles, of returning to destroy his upcoming wedding. A few even accused her of plotting revenge. Juliet sat in the small guest room Charles's mother had offered her, staring at her hands. She hadn't even done anything. Just her presence was enough to ignite chaos. The city hadn't changed, and neither had the people. She stepped outside and overheard one of the guests say, "She's trying to claw her way back into his life. Once a social climber, always a social climber." The words bit like acid. Juliet was no longer the woman who needed attention or approval. But this was exactly why she stayed away. She was a walking memory of scandal, and no one believed she could ever be anything else. Charles tried to shield her, but the damage had been done. Even some of the staff began whispering when she passed. Linda, seeing the opportunity, leaned fully into her role as victim. She began posting cryptic messages online, hinting that Charles was emotionally cheating. "Some women will stop at nothing to rewrite their past," she wrote in one caption beside a glamorous photo of her and Charles. Juliet said nothing. She didn't clap back. She didn't explain. But the weight of being misunderstood crushed her slowly. Her only escape was evening walks through the garden, where she could cry alone, far from the eyes that never stopped judging. She had come to help, to warn, to protect, but instead, she was now being painted as the threat. One evening, Juliet bumped into an old acquaintance, one of Charles's cousins who had once laughed at her downfall. "I'm surprised you have the guts to show your face here," the woman sneered. "Charles may be polite, but trust me, no one wants you here. We haven't forgotten the slap. You embarrassed all of us." Juliet stared at her, eyes steady, lips tight. She didn't argue. She simply said, "Sometimes God uses shame to strip us of our pride. But what he builds after that, it lasts." The woman laughed cruelly and walked away. But Juliet remained standing under the moonlight, her face wet with tears that no one saw, crying not because of the insult, but because no matter how much she tried to do good, her past refused to let her breathe. Still, in her heart, she knew she had to endure it, because if she didn't, Linda would destroy Charles, and Juliet wasn't about to let that happen, even if it meant being hated again. Juliet had hoped the past would stay buried, that her quiet return to the city would be just that, quiet. But one morning, as she scrolled through her phone, a viral clip surfaced on multiple platforms. It was the infamous footage from years ago, the slap. The video, once buried under newer scandals, had found new life in the hands of cruel minds. Linda's social media team had unearthed it and shared it with subtle captions like, "Some wounds don't heal, especially when they're done with a slap." The video, framed intentionally to exclude the truth, showed Juliet in expensive clothes, slapping a frail old woman, now publicly known as Charles's mother. The comments were vile. People called Juliet everything from a witch to a predator who used beauty and charm to climb into wealth. They asked why she had the audacity to return, and many openly pleaded with Charles to stay far away from her. For Juliet, it was more than just embarrassment. It was the reopening of a wound she had spent years trying to forget. That single slap had defined her in the eyes of the world, even though no one knew the pain or manipulation behind it. Charles was furious when he saw the video's resurgence. He confronted Linda that evening, asking if she had anything to do with it, but she denied involvement with practiced innocence. "I don't control the internet," she said, sipping wine with a bored expression. "Besides, people deserve to know the truth about who you're letting back into your life." Her words struck like venom, and Charles realized just how deep Linda's bitterness ran. Later that night, he called Juliet to check on her, but she didn't answer. When he visited her room the next morning, she was gone. She had left a note. It was short, written in careful handwriting. "Don't defend me. Let the world believe what it wants. Thank you for your kindness, but I won't be the reason you lose everything." The words shattered Charles. He had thought Juliet would fight, that she'd stay and stand her ground. But instead, she had chosen silence, not out of weakness, but out of dignity. And it made him see her in an entirely different light. Meanwhile, Juliet wandered the city streets, unnoticed and anonymous beneath a scarf and sunglasses. She hadn't cried yet, not because she wasn't hurting, but because she was numb. It was the same pattern repeating itself. She tried to make things right, and the world punished her for even trying. She sat on a bench outside a small church, watching as people went in and out, smiling, worshiping, living. She wanted that peace. She wanted the kind of life where her past didn't follow her like a shadow. But she knew better. For someone like her, peace didn't come easy. As she sat there, she whispered a prayer, not for herself, but for Charles. "Let him find truth. Let him be free," she said. She never imagined that even in hiding, her heart would still beat for a man she had tried so hard to forget, a man who had once represented pain, but now, strangely, reminded her of hope. Days passed, but Charles couldn't stop thinking about Juliet. Her note haunted him. He had watched her endure humiliation without fighting back, heard her speak gently even to those who mocked her, and now she had left just to protect him. It was unlike anything he had seen before. Linda, meanwhile, celebrated her small victory, growing bolder and more reckless. But things took a sudden turn when Charles's younger cousin was rushed to the hospital after a minor accident. With his parents away and Linda more concerned about dress fittings than emergencies, Charles had no one to help him. Out of instinct, he drove to Juliet's old neighborhood, hoping someone had seen her. Luckily, her aunt had returned from the hospital and informed him Juliet had taken temporary refuge with an old friend at the city's edge. Without wasting time, Charles drove there and found Juliet sitting quietly on a low stool, plucking vegetables under a mango tree. She was shocked to see him. "What are you doing here?" she asked, standing quickly, wiping her hands on her wrapper. Charles didn't answer immediately. He stared at her, his voice low with emotion. "I need you," he said. "Not for me. For Kamsi. He had a bad fall. We're all over the place. Please come." Juliet hesitated, then nodded. She followed him without saying much, her heart conflicted but her conscience clear. At the hospital, she slipped back into quiet strength, organizing, cleaning, calming Kamsi, even speaking to the doctors when Charles grew overwhelmed. She didn't demand recognition. She didn't ask questions. She just acted from a place of love. And for the first time, Charles saw how selfless she truly was. Linda, however, was enraged when she found out. She stormed into the hospital, throwing accusations and insults, but Juliet walked away without responding. just like she always did now. That evening, Charles found Juliet on the hospital's rooftop, watching the city lights. "You didn't have to come," he said softly. "But you did. Again." Juliet gave a small smile. "You're not the first person I've helped who wouldn't thank me publicly." Charles stepped closer, his expression serious. "You know, Juliet, this city may never forgive you. But I see you now. Not the girl from that video. The woman who stayed behind when everyone else walked out." Juliet's eyes filled with tears, but she turned away. "Don't say things like that. You're getting married to someone everyone thinks is perfect." Charles laughed bitterly. "Perfection is an illusion. And love, well, I'm beginning to realize it's not about perfection at all." The wind blew between them as silence settled, thick, heavy, and filled with unsaid emotions. Juliet didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for that moment, on that rooftop, she felt seen. And for someone like her, that was everything. Linda had never been one to lose gracefully. When she realized Juliet was still in Charles's life, even if just as a quiet helper, she began to spiral. She wasn't threatened by Juliet's beauty or grace. She was threatened by something she couldn't understand: resilience. Where Linda used manipulation, Juliet used silence. Where Linda wanted applause, Juliet walked away. And that terrified her. In her desperation, Linda devised a plan. She knew Charles was vulnerable and tired, overwhelmed by family pressure and the engagement arrangements. So she did what she knew best: lied. One morning, with crocodile tears in her eyes, she told Charles she was pregnant. "I found out this morning," she said shakily. "I didn't know how to tell you. I know we've had our issues, but this changes everything." Charles froze. The news hit him like a truck. He wasn't ready. He didn't even trust her. But if it was true, he would have to act responsibly. Juliet heard the news later that day from one of the staff, and though her face remained composed, her heart crumbled inside. She didn't cry, but she felt hollow. Of course this would happen. It always happened. Just when she thought she could breathe again, life reminded her she wasn't meant for fairy tales. That evening, she packed her few belongings quietly. There was no anger, no accusations, just sadness. She couldn't stay and watch Charles tie himself to someone he didn't love, not while pretending it didn't affect her. As she closed her bag, Charles entered the room, eyes confused and hurt. "Why are you leaving again?" he asked. Juliet looked up at him, voice soft. "Because I love myself now. And staying would mean watching someone I care about drown while pretending I'm not dying inside." Charles reached for her hand, but she pulled away gently. "Congratulations," she whispered. "I hope it's real." But deep down, Juliet knew it wasn't. There had been no signs of Linda's pregnancy, no doctor visits, no morning sickness, no change in behavior. It was a trap. She was sure of it. But proving it would only make her look desperate. So she left without a fight. Meanwhile, Charles tried to be responsible, attending Linda's checkups and trying to prepare for fatherhood. But each day, something gnawed at him. Linda's stories didn't add up. Her appointments were always private. She refused to let him come. And when he pressed her, she became emotional and manipulative. It all felt too familiar, like a storm was building again. And this time, Charles didn't know if he had the strength to survive it, or if he could do it without Juliet. The gala was supposed to be a night of beauty, fashion, and status, a celebration of Charles's family's legacy in the city. Juliet wasn't supposed to be there. She had returned her invite quietly, aware of the growing tension surrounding her presence. But Charles had personally asked her to attend, not for the media, not for a spectacle, but because he wanted someone authentic beside him. She hesitated, but in the end she wore a modest but elegant dress and arrived quietly, slipping through the side entrance to avoid cameras. For a while, everything was calm. She stayed close to the shadows, watching Charles from afar, quietly proud of how he carried himself. Then came Linda. Dripping in gold and rage, she stormed toward Juliet and, without warning, tossed a glass of wine in her face in front of several guests. The music stopped. Conversations froze. And Juliet, soaked and stunned, said nothing. Her silence was louder than any scream could have been. Gasps followed. Phones were pulled out. Social media began buzzing instantly. "She's here for attention," Linda shouted. "She always has been. You think because you fooled him, you'll fool the rest of us? Let me remind you who you are." The humiliation was suffocating. The same guests who had once praised Juliet's strength now stared in disgust, whispering among themselves. Charles rushed forward to confront Linda, but it was too late. Juliet had already fled. She ran out into the night, her eyes burning with tears, her spirit crushed under the weight of shame and exhaustion. It wasn't just about Linda or Charles anymore. It was the realization that no matter how much she changed, the world would still reduce her to that one slap, that one mistake, that one moment. She walked the streets for hours, past night vendors and sleeping beggars, until she reached the only place that ever made sense when everything fell apart: home. She didn't go to her mother's house, though. She went to an abandoned shack where she once sold pure water as a child, sitting on the cold step like it still belonged to her. There, Juliet broke down completely. The sobs were ugly, raw, and loud, not the quiet weeping of someone trying to hide, but the guttural cries of a woman finally reaching the end of herself. In that moment, she cursed her past, her mistakes, her ambitions, and even her love. "Why do I keep trying?" she whispered into the night. "Why does love always feel like punishment?" She had given up everything, her pride, her reputation, her silence, to protect people who didn't even believe in her. And for what? To be mocked again? Rejected again? Juliet had never felt so empty. Her body trembled not just from a cold, but from the ache in her heart that refused to go away. Back in his room, Charles sat alone, replaying the night over and over in his mind. The way Juliet looked at him before she ran, as though something inside her had finally died. He hadn't done enough. He should have stopped Linda sooner, shielded Juliet from the madness. But he had hesitated, torn between protecting his family's image and standing by the woman who had saved him more times than he could count. As he tried to call Juliet for the 100th time, the line remained switched off. Then, as if fate needed him to suffer more, he stumbled on a shoebox Juliet had left behind in her room. Inside were handwritten letters, dozens of them, all addressed to one person: his mother. He pulled one out and read slowly, his chest tightening with every word. Juliet had poured her entire soul into those letters, confessions, apologies, explanations, none of which had ever been delivered. One letter read, "I didn't mean to slap you. I was angry, I was stupid, but mostly I was afraid. Afraid that someone else was testing me again. I know now it wasn't about pride, it was about my shame. You reminded me of who I once was, struggling, desperate, invisible. And I took that out on you. I'm sorry. Not because you're Charles's mother, but because I know how it feels to be overlooked." Another letter was even more heartbreaking. "Sometimes I dream of being accepted, even if it's just for a day where I'm not the villain in everyone's story." Charles couldn't breathe. The pain he had seen in her eyes now had depth, context, and weight. These weren't the words of a gold digger or manipulator. These were the words of a woman clawing through shame, searching for redemption, and begging to be seen. He took the entire box and drove to his mother's room without warning. She was seated on her bed, looking older than ever, frail, thinner, and lost in thought. Charles dropped the box beside her. "You said you wanted to test her," he said bitterly. "Well, here's your answer." He left the room before she could reply. Hours passed, and when he returned, he found his mother with tears streaming down her face, clutching one of the letters to her chest. "I didn't know," she whispered. I thought she was like the others. But she's not." That night, for the first time since the slap, Charles's mother saw Juliet not as a mistake or threat, but as a reflection of the broken girl she once was herself. And in that moment, a seed of regret began to take root, one that would soon grow into a plea for forgiveness. The following morning, the city buzzed with new gossip. Charles was reconsidering his engagement to Linda. Linda, furious, locked herself in her apartment and refused to speak to anyone. But Charles had no time for drama. His heart was in one place, with Juliet. Before searching for her, he confronted his mother one last time. "You broke her," he said. "And I let you." I was too weak to stand by her. We both owe her more than silence." His mother, visibly shaken, nodded. "I was wrong," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I did everything I accused her of. I judged her the same way I once hated being judged. I wanted to protect you, Charles, but all I did was destroy someone who needed healing, not humiliation." Charles didn't reply. The truth was already heavy enough. He packed a bag, determined to find Juliet no matter how far she had run. Meanwhile, Juliet had returned to her aunt's small village, miles away from the city. Her phone remained off. She had cut herself off from everything, not to punish anyone, but to protect her sanity. She spent her days helping with house chores, fetching water, and tending to the small farm beside the hut. It was peaceful, but the pain in her heart hadn't faded. Every time she saw a young girl playing, she remembered her younger self, full of dreams and blind trust. And every night, when she lay on the floor to sleep, she dreamed of Charles, not the man with money or power, but the boy who once offered her a glass of water when no one else did. That memory kept her going. It reminded her that no matter how ugly the world became, there was still goodness somewhere. Back in the city, Charles's mother did something no one expected. She dressed in simple clothing, took a long cab ride to Juliet's aunt's house, and arrived just before dusk. Juliet, seeing her at the door, froze. The woman who had once pretended to be a maid, who had watched her every move with suspicion, now stood with swollen eyes and trembling lips. "I came to ask for your forgiveness," she said quietly. Juliet didn't respond immediately. The silence between them was thick, heavy with old pain. But when Juliet finally spoke, it was with surprising calm. "Why now?" she asked. The old woman stepped forward, holding Juliet's letters in a plastic bag. "Because I finally read your heart, not just your actions. And I saw myself in your pain." Juliet didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply nodded and stepped aside to let her in. The conversation that followed would begin the slow, tender process of mending what years of judgment had broken. Juliet thought that the worst had passed. She had faced humiliation, abandonment, and regret. She had accepted that peace would never look like a grand life in the city or a ring on her finger. It would look like mornings spent in silence and evenings spent in reflection. But just when she began to breathe again, the past came knocking. A black SUV arrived at the village compound one humid afternoon. Juliet's name was called, and before she could ask what was happening, two uniformed officers handcuffed her. "You're under arrest for embezzlement and theft from Charles Holdings," one said coldly. Her world spun. Her aunt screamed as villagers gathered. The same Juliet who had come to them quietly, who helped them fetch water and weed farms, was now being dragged away like a criminal. The humiliation was indescribable. Her chest tightened. "There's a mistake," she pleaded, but they didn't care. The journey back to the city was long, and Juliet didn't say a word. Her soul had detached from her body. Again, she was judged, not by what she did, but by the story others chose to write about her. Back in the city, social media lit up with headlines. Disgraced ex-fiancé detained in fraud case, Juliet Acano finally exposed, and from maid slapper to corporate thief? The comments were worse than before. Everyone had an opinion, and none of them knew the truth. Juliet sat in the cold interrogation room, staring at the wall, unmoving. The officer interrogating her pushed papers at her, demanding signatures, false confessions. But she refused. Her eyes were dead, her voice calm. "If I stole anything, prove it." They couldn't. But someone had planted documents in her name. Bank transactions, false authorizations, signatures mimicking hers. It was all forged, but it looked real enough to damage her reputation permanently. Behind the scenes, Linda had used her family's connection and her inside access to the company's systems to create a perfect scandal. She knew Charles was growing distant, and she needed to remove Juliet permanently. What better way than to make her a criminal? Word reached Charles in pieces. At first, he didn't believe it. But when he saw the arrest report and false documents, his instinct screamed. None of it made sense. Juliet had no access to the company's internal finances, nor the skill to forge entire trails. And then he remembered Linda's sudden desire to help with company files a few months back, her oddly timed suggestions to digitize everything and clear out old paperwork. The pieces began to click. He visited the station, demanding to see Juliet. She was pale, silent, and wouldn't meet his eyes. "You don't have to say anything," he told her gently. "I'll find the truth." But Juliet only smiled faintly. "Even if you do, Charles, they'll never see me the way you do. Not your mother. Not the world. I'm just the woman who slapped a maid and stole from a company." Charles's heart broke. It wasn't just about clearing her name anymore. It was about proving that even the most shattered heart could still shine. Charles didn't sleep. He dove into the investigation with the focus of a man possessed. He personally combed through every internal document, every email log, every office camera recording from the last 6 months. He interviewed staff, called in external auditors, even consulted digital forensics experts. The truth started trickling out slowly. A junior IT officer admitted seeing Linda in the finance server room late one night. A cleaner recalled seeing Linda printing and shredding stacks of paper weeks before Juliet's arrest. The biggest breakthrough came when Charles checked the company's fingerprint entry logs. Juliet hadn't accessed the floors in question in over 3 months, but Linda had been there multiple times. Charles pulled security footage and sat with his legal team. "This was a setup," one of the lawyers said bluntly. "The forged authorizations all point back to the same workstation, the one Linda uses." Armed with evidence, Charles stormed into Linda's home without warning. She was startled, but still tried to maintain her icy composure. "Is this about Juliet again?" she asked lazily, sipping wine. Charles slammed the printed files on her table. "You forged financial records. You faked authorizations. You had Juliet arrested based on your lies." Her smile faltered. "Prove it," she whispered. He leaned in. "I already did. The lawyers are filing a report. The company board wants a criminal investigation." Panic crossed her face for the first time. "Do you know what you're doing?" she hissed. "You're choosing her over everything we built." Charles looked at her, his voice calm but deadly. "You're right. I'm choosing her. Not because she's perfect, but because she never pretended to be. You destroyed someone just to win a man who stopped loving you long ago." He walked out, leaving Linda with her trembling hands and collapsing lies. By the end of that week, Linda's name was dragged across the very tabloids she once fed stories to. Corporate heiress caught in web of lies. Jealous fiancé framed ex for theft. Charles Okonkwo's ex facing arrest. But Juliet was nowhere to be found. The police dropped charges and issued a public statement clearing her name, but she didn't come to the press. She didn't go home. She vanished again. It was as though she had dissolved into thin air. Charles searched everywhere. Her aunt's home, her old boarding house, even her church. No one knew. No one had seen her. And that's when it hit him. She hadn't just left the city. She had left her own story. She didn't want applause or vindication. She just wanted to be forgotten so that she could finally heal. The dusty road leading to the outskirts of Ogboni was quiet as dusk fell. The small village, tucked between hills and rivers, was the last place anyone would expect to find a woman like Juliet, and that was exactly why she came. She had paid a boy to deliver a single message to her aunt: "Don't look for me." The villagers didn't know her name. They called her Neoma, the good woman. She lived in a one-room mud house, taught children basic reading, and cooked at the local school for free. Her skin had tanned, her hands grew rough from farm work, and her voice had softened with time. No makeup, no jewelry, no phones. Just peace, or something that resembled it. But inside, her heart still carried the scars. Every time she looked at a little girl's eyes, she remembered the child she used to be. Hopeful, dreaming, loud. Now, she was none of those things. She was quiet and tired, but somehow whole. Every night she wrote in a small journal she kept under her pillow. Not letters this time, but thoughts. She wrote about betrayal, about regret, about shame, and even about love. She didn't curse Linda or Charles. In fact, she rarely mentioned them. But she did write one thing repeatedly: "I still wonder if he's looking for me." That question haunted her. Not because she needed him to come, but because part of her still believed that if he did, maybe she wasn't as forgettable as the world made her feel. Sometimes she'd cry while watching the moon, praying silently, "God, if you have anything left for me, please, let it not be more pain." There was no answer, just silence. But in that silence, she found strength, the kind that doesn't come from being loved, but from surviving without it. Back in the city, Charles wasn't giving up. He visited every surrounding town, following small rumors and vague tips. He posted no online messages. He didn't involve media or detectives. He simply searched, holding only one photo of Juliet and her last letter. "She's out there," he whispered every morning. "And I'll find her." Not to fix her, but to tell her she was never broken. His journey led him to a woman in Enugu who mentioned a quiet helper in Agbani who matched Juliet's description. Charles took the next available bus. The ride was long, bumpy, and dusty, but his hope was alive. As the bus pulled into the tiny village square, he stepped down with a beating heart. And at the corner of the field, by the old school garden, he saw her, bent over, planting yams with local children, her scarf slightly loose, her face marked by sun and simplicity. It was her, Juliet, not the Juliet the city tried to ruin, but the woman he had come to love, quietly, completely, and without conditions. News of Juliet's innocence spread across tabloids and blogs like wildfire, but to her it meant nothing. She had already buried the version of herself that ever wanted the world's applause. While society debated whether she was misunderstood or a manipulative genius, Juliet was drawing water from a clay well barefoot, humming lullabies to little children at dusk. She didn't care anymore. She didn't care that her name was cleared or that Linda was now the public villain. She had lost too much, and even if the world handed her an apology carved in diamonds, it wouldn't restore what she had to burn to survive. The people in the village loved her, but none of them knew who she really was. And she preferred it that way. Every day, she buried herself in chores and silence, convincing herself she didn't miss Charles or his mother or the life she once dreamed of. But some nights, after everyone had fallen asleep, she would walk to the edge of the riverbank and cry like she did when she was a child, quietly, desperately, without expecting comfort. In the city, Charles couldn't sleep. Even though Juliet's name was officially cleared, it meant little without her beside him. He had found the legal documents, exposed the truth, and watched as Linda's entire family distanced themselves from her. The board reinstated Juliet's honor, and even Charles's mother publicly denounced Linda in shame. But none of that mattered. Charles would trade it all, the justice, the apologies, the articles, just to see Juliet smile again. He knew now that he didn't love Juliet out of pity or guilt. He loved her because she was the most courageous woman he had ever met. The strength it took to keep standing after being dragged through hell, not once, but repeatedly, wasn't something that could be explained. He longed to hold her and tell her that she was not just cleared in name, but cherished. And so, even when the world celebrated his so-called victory, Charles remained haunted by her absence. Without her, everything felt incomplete. But Juliet didn't know how to return, or even if she should. What place did she have in a world that once spat on her name and called her a disgrace? Even if Charles still loved her, would his mother truly accept her now, knowing all she'd done, all she'd been? Juliet had come so far in rediscovering her strength, yet she felt like a ghost, visible to none, floating in memories of heartbreak. One day, she heard women gossiping nearby about the wicked girl who slapped her fiancé's mother and got disgraced. They didn't recognize her in her faded wrapper and bare feet. They spoke with cruel laughter, confident that Juliet was probably hiding in shame. She listened quietly, fighting back tears. It wasn't the insult that hurt. It was the reminder that no matter how far she ran, the world's memory of her would always follow. That evening, as she sat beneath a tree staring into the setting sun, she whispered, "Even if I never go back, please let someone believe in me again." The next morning, Juliet woke to the sound of quiet commotion near the school garden. Children were excitedly whispering that a tall man in city clothes had arrived asking for Neoma. She froze. Her heart pounded violently as she stepped outside her hut and saw him, Charles, standing under the mango tree, his shirt dusty, eyes red from exhaustion. He looked different, worn, desperate, but gentle. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The children giggled and ran off, leaving them alone under the tree. "Hi," Charles finally said, his voice hoarse. Juliet looked away. "Why are you here?" she asked quietly, her hands trembling. "To bring you home," he replied. She shook her head, laughing bitterly. "There's no home left for me in your world. I'm not the Juliet you once knew." Charles took a step closer. "Good. Because I don't want the Juliet I once knew. I want the woman you became, the one who walked through fire and never let it consume her." Her eyes brimmed with tears, but she didn't let them fall. "You don't know what I've lost, Charles," she whispered. "I lost myself." Charles sat on the dry ground and invited her to sit beside him. Hesitant at first, she finally joined him. For hours they talked. Not about grand dreams or revenge or justice, but about pain. Juliet shared what it felt like to be arrested, to be spat on, to be called names she didn't deserve. She spoke about the ache of losing everything she once believed in, about feeling unworthy of love, about how silence became her refuge. Charles listened without interrupting, his hand occasionally brushing hers, his eyes never leaving her face. He told her about the nights he searched for her, about the guilt he carried for not protecting her sooner, about the loneliness that swallowed him after she left. There were no grand declarations of love, just raw truth. And in that truth, a deeper bond formed, not just between lovers, but between two people who had bled, healed, and bled again. Their connection no longer needed validation. It simply existed, quiet and unshakable. As the sky darkened, Charles looked at Juliet and said, "Come back with me. Not for the world, not for them, but for us." Juliet was quiet for a long time before she finally answered, "I'm scared, Charles. Scared that the moment I step back into your life, your mother will break me again." He nodded, understanding. "Then let's not go back to my life. Let's build a new one where we write the rules." She looked at him, eyes wide. "You do that?" He nodded again. "I'd do anything for the woman who taught me what strength looks like." Juliet smiled faintly for the first time in weeks. That night, she didn't cry into her pillow. She slept, not because the pain was gone, but because she no longer carried it alone. The next day, Charles didn't ask Juliet to pack. He stayed in the village with her. He helped wash cassava, fetch firewood, and teach multiplication tables to small children. The villagers, who once viewed him with suspicion, began to warm up to him. They watched how he looked at Juliet, not with pity or obsession, but reverence. For 3 days, he lived her life. He bathed with a bucket, ate from firewood stoves, and slept on a bamboo mat. Juliet watched him in silence, slowly realizing that the man she thought belonged to the city was ready to lose everything just to understand her world. On the 4th night, they sat by a small fire while a light breeze passed through the trees. Charles asked her a simple question. "What did you dream of before all this?" Juliet looked into the flames, then answered, "I used to dream of being seen, not admired or desired, but understood." He nodded slowly. "Then let me be the one who sees you, even in your worst." Juliet opened up like never before. She told him stories she had never shared with anyone. About the time her classmates laughed when her slippers tore on stage during a school play. About how her first crush once told her she was too loud and too local to be loved. About the night she slapped the old woman and knew instantly that she had ruined her own life. She didn't speak as a victim or as a heroine. She just spoke as Juliet, a flawed, layered, deeply wounded woman trying to rebuild. Charles listened with an ache in his heart. Every story made him want to hug her tighter, shield her deeper. He didn't interrupt, didn't pity. He only asked one thing when she paused. "Did you ever forgive yourself for that slap?" She bit her lip. "No, because it wasn't just a slap. It was everything I used to be, proud, blind, bitter. That slap haunts me more than anything." Charles reached out, holding her hand. "Then let me walk with you till it doesn't haunt you anymore." That night, he didn't sleep in his corner. Juliet called him over and laid her head on his shoulder as the wind rustled through the trees. They didn't kiss. They didn't whisper vows. But in the silence, something shifted. Juliet no longer felt like she was hiding. She was still afraid, yes, but not alone. And Charles, for the first time in a long time, felt like he had found the woman he had been searching for his entire life. Not a perfect partner, but a soul brave enough to rebuild from ruins. He saw now that Juliet was never the arrogant girl people once described. She was a mirror of their judgments, a product of wounds no one asked about. And now, as he watched her fall asleep beside him, her breath calm and steady, he knew she wasn't the woman he once loved. She was the woman he was finally ready to love, fully, openly, and for the rest of his life. It was a kind of evening that felt like a painting. Clouds gray with sorrow, trees swaying with secrets, and rain slowly gathering in the sky. Juliet stood under the mango tree that had become her quiet place since Charles arrived. The wind whispered the kinds of truths people didn't speak aloud, the regrets, the wounds, the unspoken love. Charles joined her there, holding a small umbrella above them as the first droplets began to fall. He didn't speak for a while, and neither did she. Their silence wasn't awkward, it was full of meaning, like two hearts sinking without words. Juliet, in her worn wrapper and simple blouse, looked nothing like the girl who once lived for attention. And Charles, with his muddy shoes and undone collar, looked nothing like the man who once walked red carpets. And yet, in that moment, they looked like everything they had always needed. As thunder rumbled in the distance, Charles turned to her, his eyes misted. "I can't imagine a life without you anymore," he said softly. "Not because I pity you, but because I love you. All of you, even the broken pieces." Juliet's breath caught. She looked away, struggling to steady herself. "Charles," she began, her voice trembling, "you don't owe me this. I don't want to be the girl you rescue because you feel guilty or want to fix what your mother did. I'm not some poor girl who needs saving anymore. I don't want to enter your world through pity." Charles took a small box from his pocket and opened it. Inside was a simple ring, nothing extravagant, just a silver band with a tiny stone. "This isn't about pity," he said. "It's about partnership. I want you beside me, not behind me, not beneath me. You've seen me at my worst, and I've seen you rise from ashes. There's no one else I trust more." Rain began to fall heavier, soaking them both. Juliet laughed bitterly through her tears. "Do you know what they'll say? That you're marrying the girl who slapped your mother, who got arrested, who was once a laughingstock." Charles stepped closer and cupped her face. "Then let them talk," he whispered. "Because while they're talking, we'll be building something they'll never understand. Love without conditions." The rain poured, but they didn't move. Juliet's heart was beating so fast it hurt. She had imagined proposals before, grand ones, with violin music and luxury. But this, under the rain, with a man who saw her scars and still reached for her, this felt real. She dropped to her knees in the muddy earth, tears pouring down her face. "Why me?" she cried. "Why would you choose someone so damaged, so judged?" So Charles knelt beside her and took her hands. "Because no one has ever taught me more about grace than you. You're not broken, Juliet. You're beautiful. Not in spite of your story, but because of it." She nodded slowly, her voice cracking. "Then, yes. Yes, I'll marry you. But not to prove them wrong. To prove to myself that I still deserve love." And just like that, in the middle of the storm, two shattered hearts made a vow that didn't need an altar. Just rain, truth, and a love that had already survived fire. News of the engagement reached the city before Charles and Juliet returned. Whispers, disbelief, mockery, it all spread like wildfire. But none of it compared to the storm brewing inside Charles's mother. She had heard the announcement from one of her sisters, who spat the words with disgust. "Your son is marrying that same girl, the one you tested and disgraced." The old woman sat in silence, her breathing heavy, her hands trembling. For years, she had told herself she did what she did to protect her son. She disguised herself as a maid to expose greed, and she believed she had succeeded. But the woman Charles was marrying now was nothing like the girl she judged. Juliet had endured what no one should ever face, and still rose with dignity. The guilt gnawed at her, especially when she saw a recent photo of Juliet smiling in her village, mud on her feet and light in her eyes. It was then she realized the truth. She hadn't just tested Juliet. She had broken her. And somehow, Juliet survived despite her. When Charles brought Juliet home to visit, the house fell into quiet tension. Juliet's steps were slow, unsure. She had been here before, once as a pretender, now as herself. She didn't know what to expect, but she held her head high. The old woman came out slowly, supported by a cane. Her eyes met Juliet's and held them for what felt like eternity. Then, in front of the household staff, neighbors, and distant relatives who had gathered out of curiosity, the old woman did the unthinkable. She dropped to her knees. "I was wrong," she said, her voice cracking. "I dressed like a maid to test your character. But I forgot mine in the process. I judged you. I hurt you. I destroyed your name." The crowd gasped. Juliet stood frozen, tears gathering. "I didn't ask you to kneel," Juliet whispered. The old woman nodded. "I needed to. Not for show. But because I want to ask, from the depth of a mother's shame, can you ever forgive me?" Charles stepped back, giving Juliet the moment. Juliet walked slowly toward her and knelt beside her. "I forgave you a long time ago," she said. "But I didn't know if you'd ever see me again without shame in your eyes." The old woman began to weep. "I see you now, fully, and I'm proud my son chose you." Juliet lifted her up and held her close. There were no cameras, no audience clapping, just broken people making peace. For the first time in years, Juliet didn't feel like the girl who slapped a stranger. She felt like a woman finally seen. That night, the old woman called Charles aside and gave him the ring she had once hidden. "She's your miracle," she said. "Don't ever forget what it took for her to still say yes." Charles cried for the first time since childhood. In that house where shame once echoed through hallways, love had finally found its voice. Juliet didn't walk into the city with pride. She walked in with peace. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. The people who had laughed at her once now stared in awe. Some faked kindness, others offered apologies. But Juliet didn't need their validation. She had already fought the war of self-worth and come out whole. As she and Charles planned a quiet wedding, people offered luxury venues, designers, and media coverage. She turned it all down. "I want it small. I want it honest. I don't need cameras. I just need truth," she said. Even when her dressmaker offered an extravagant gown, Juliet chose a simple, graceful design, the kind that reminded her of who she had become. She spent her final nights before the wedding writing letters to herself. One to the girl she used to be, one to the woman she had become, and one to the future she was finally ready to embrace. She didn't ask for perfection. She asked for peace. Charles understood her wishes. He had changed, too. No longer the man controlled by society's gaze, he became her shield, not in front of her, but beside her. They moved into a modest apartment where they cooked together, laughed over burnt rice, and watched rain fall from the balcony. These weren't the fairy tales Juliet once dreamed of, but they were real, and that made them better. Her mother came to visit, crying with joy as she saw the peace in her daughter's eyes. Even the villagers who once teased Juliet now sent gifts, small handwritten blessings wrapped in raffia. And though Juliet still carried scars, they no longer bled. Every wound had healed into wisdom. Her joy wasn't loud, it was quiet, steady, like the hum of a song only she could hear. It was the kind of joy that came after fire, after flood, after loss. But what moved Juliet the most wasn't the love of Charles, or even the apology of his mother. It was watching her own heart forgive herself. One morning, as she stood by the mirror, she looked at her reflection and whispered, "I'm proud of you." Not because she had won Charles, but because she had faced humiliation, judgment, and betrayal, and still chose not to harden. She had returned to a place where she was once reduced to nothing, and rose without vengeance. She had proven that a woman's worth is not in how many people cheer her name, but how she holds her silence in storms. The return of joy wasn't a ceremony. It was a quiet reclaiming of her name, her worth, and her peace. And Juliet, once mocked and broken, was finally whole. The day arrived, not with loud trumpets or camera flashes, but with a sunrise so gentle it seemed as if the heavens were honoring Juliet's quiet strength. There was no grand hall rented, no celebrity wedding planners, no influencers invited. Only a small open courtyard behind Charles's grandmother's old home. The chairs were simple wood, decorated with hibiscus flowers picked by local children. Juliet stood before the mirror in her modest white gown, her hands trembling slightly. The dress was handmade by a woman in her village who couldn't stop crying while stitching it, telling her, "You're the reason my daughter believed in second chances." Juliet's hair was styled in soft curls, her makeup barely there, just enough to catch the light in her tearful eyes. She looked at her reflection, not as a bride, but as a woman reborn. She had walked through shame, been mocked, jailed, and slandered. Yet she stood, pure in heart, not because she was perfect, but because she had refused to let bitterness win. Outside, Charles stood nervously, wearing a traditional agbada, simple but majestic in its dignity. His mother, now walking with a cane, sat quietly with tears already in her eyes. She had insisted on being the one to receive Juliet first. When Juliet stepped out, the entire courtyard fell silent. There were no murmurs of luxury or fashion, only the soft rustle of the wind and a collective awe at how grace could wear the skin of a woman who once knelt in mud. Charles's mother stood slowly and walked toward her. In front of everyone, she held Juliet's hands and said, "I once mistook your strength for arrogance, your silence for pride. I now know better. Today, I gain not just a daughter-in-law, but a mirror that showed me my flaws. Thank you for not letting my mistake become your identity." Juliet's voice cracked as she whispered, "Thank you for finally seeing me." They embraced, not as mother and daughter, but as two wounded women finally releasing the past. When Juliet finally reached Charles, he looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, with reverence, awe, and an unshakable love. They didn't recite lengthy vows. Instead, they spoke their hearts in the language only the broken understand. "I choose you," Charles said simply, "every time, even when the world points fingers." Juliet responded through tears, "And I choose you not because you love me, but because you saw the parts no one else did and didn't run." As they exchanged rings, the sky remained clear, the sun casting a golden hue over them like a blessing. There was no priest, just a family elder who whispered prayers in his dialect and said, "Let no shame return to this woman's name." And with that, Juliet, once mocked, once judged, became a bride, not clothed in diamonds, but in dignity. As they kissed gently, the courtyard erupted in quiet claps and teary smiles. No applause had ever felt so loud. Marriage, for Juliet and Charles, was never going to be about perfection. It was always going to be about grace. They didn't return to a mansion or some exotic honeymoon. They went home to the same apartment where they had shared silence and rain. Their first night as husband and wife was not filled with luxury, but with storytelling. They lay in bed facing each other, sharing the versions of their childhood that shaped them, laughing at mistakes, weeping over scars. Juliet told him how, as a child, she once stole groundnuts from the market just to feed her mother. Charles told her how he used to cry in secret because his father ignored him. They kissed not out of lust, but out of shared understanding. Two souls finally at peace. They didn't need grand gestures, just the safety of each other's arms, and the calm that came with knowing they had been through the worst and survived. As days passed, the city whispered again. People couldn't stop talking about the girl who once slapped a maid and ended up marrying into the same family. But Juliet didn't flinch anymore. She walked through the markets with her basket, still greeting vendors who used to hiss at her. Some still gossiped. Others now greeted her with respect. She didn't need everyone to approve. She just needed to remain kind. Charles stood by her side in everything. When someone tried to bring up her past at a family gathering, he smiled and said, "Yes, and that past made her who she is. I love all of it." Juliet spent her evenings tending to her small garden, finding healing in planting new life. And every now and then, she'd visit the mango tree, the place where Charles proposed, just to remind herself that even rain couldn't drown love that was real. And under that same tree, one morning, she found herself writing again, not letters of apology, but letters of gratitude to herself, to God, and to the journey that saved her. In time, people forgot the slap. They forgot the scandal, the rumors, the shame. But Juliet didn't. She kept them folded like fragile clothes in her memory, not to relive the pain, but to honor the survival. She became Charles's best friend, not just his wife. They cooked together, argued with laughter, and healed each other in ways only the wounded could. His mother would visit often, now frail, always holding Juliet's hands longer than needed. One evening she whispered, "I'm glad he chose you. I only wish I'd seen your worth earlier." Juliet smiled, replying, "Maybe we both had to learn the hard way." And when the first rain of the next season came, Juliet stood on her balcony, lifted her face, and let it fall. Not to wash away shame, but to feel alive. Because in the end, the girl who once knelt in mud, mocked and misunderstood, had become more than just a wife. She had become a flame, one that burned through disgrace, rejection, and sorrow, and still chose to shine. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel Tochi Stories for more.